in some ways, you and the Zionists have accepted a fundamental framework that I think a lot of the rest of us are trying to like push back on, which is that like to oppose Israel isn't to oppose Jewish people, and that's kind of stupid. This is an actual government.
But in America, we just need to do a better job of managing that. And I think that the Jewish community's out of control.
Part of it is fundamentally built into the religion that like it's about past suffering, is like a big part of it.
It is a bigger issue than the neocons.
Dave Smith and Nick Fuentes just clashed over the best way to oppose Israel's influence in the U.S. government. This is an area of disagreement in a 3.5 podcast where there were some agreements. So let's break down where their differences lie, with Nick arguing that this issue goes deeper than Israel and into Judaism itself, and Dave arguing that this is an extension of government power and government influence in our government. So let's take a look. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
One of the things that concerns me with what you're doing, and I guess concerns me with the fact that I think you're winning in a lot of ways, and I don't, but I do worry about this disaster there, is that I do think so much of the energy you're harnessing does get pointed at just regular people. Like just, until the Jordan Peterson clip, when I first started realizing we were going to have to do this, I had kind of just been like, the reason I was like, I don't think I'll do another podcast with Nick was never because I didn't like you. I always liked you when we talked. I always thought the conversations were really interesting, as this one is. The thing was just, it's just like an incentives issue almost. We're like, well, I don't know, everyone on this side is going to lose their goddamn shit, and then I have to answer a million questions about that, but fuck them, so that's not enough to get me to stop doing it. But then half your audience is just going to call me a fucking Jew anyway, and so it's like, what's the point here? And I think that like, look, and I want to get into this more, but like, yeah, there are questions of Jewish identity. There are questions. Obviously, there's a relationship there. But the fact is that, say, look, the worst thing in my lifetime that Israel's done to the United States of America. I'm not sold on the 9/11 stuff. There's some questions there, but I think it's far from as conclusive. I think people are way out over their skis saying they know for a fact Israel did 9/11, but that's a topic for another day. But it was the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq is no question, and Coleman Hughes can try to argue with me about this, there's just no question that the neoconservatives and the Likud party and the whole Bush administration, this was pushed in a direction. It's not the only factor, but it is more than what made the difference. Like, the war does not happen without the neocons and without Netanyahu. It just doesn't. And yet at the same time, Jewish Americans were either the best or one of the best groups on that issue. Jews opposed the war in Iraq way ahead of the general public. And like right-wing Christians were like the worst group on that.
I hate to admit that, and I'm a right-wing Christian. I guess I'm a right-wing radical libertarian, but that was true, and that's where my headspace was. I was a neocon. I've talked about it many times. It's embarrassing, but Dave's right. Jewish Americans actually opposed the Iraq war in spades. This is something that isn't always brought up, but the point he's making here is that this was governmental influence. This was lobbying interests from the Likudniks, which are essentially Israel's version of the neocons. And I wouldn't even stop there. There were liberal establishment types like, hey, Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton that never saw a war they didn't want to support, so they supported it too. Of course, the neocons pushed it, but the point Dave's making is that you can't blame international Jewry for things like the Iraq war, whereas it seems like some people are apt to criticize, the outgrowth of this influence in our government on Judaism in general. So I think this is a good point.
And so, but again, my target isn't them. My target isn't the people. Right. My target is like the people who propagandized them into believing that. And so, if the thing is like, hey, I stopped short at like actually naming the Jews, it's like, well, yeah, because I don't think that's right. And I don't like, yes, there, and we can get into more of this, but like, no, like Barry the dentist has nothing to do with any of this. And he, I think on some level, maybe I'm wrong, but I also don't think you're really trying to gin up hatred toward that guy. And so maybe that's why I stopped short of blaming the Jews. I think it's sloppier and not as accurate.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I think it's important just on a basic level to say that we don't agree on everything. Like, we are distinct, and I wouldn't even say it's about further or closer. It's just that we are coming at it from different places. You believe it's the neocons, and it's in particular the War Party and Israel, and how those interact. And me, as an identitarian, I do look at the world through an identity-based lens, that you've got whites, blacks, Jews, and they all have political interest. They all identify as these groups. They group up based on them, and then those groups have conflicting interests. That's what politics has become, is like meeting out those interests. Like, is it in the interest of white people to go to war in Iraq? No. But for Jews, yes, because they have this connection to Israel. And same about all these other things. And so, even getting back to our beef, we could quibble about, I don't think there's some conspiracy. I don't think they got together and said, let's invite Dave because, he's going to maintain censorship and Jewish control. I don't believe that. But I do believe that you clearly take the more moderate position, or even I would say the more liberal position. As a libertarian, you're like a lowercase l liberal in the sense that you think that it's, like you said, it's not Jews in themselves or Jewish identity in itself. It is particular people in power, in particularly the state, that are doing these violent policies, whereas me, it is maybe a more radical rejection of liberalism. And I think that, maybe you're informed by your Jewish identity, or you're just ideologically believe that. It is a more moderate position, and they platform that because that's the version they want. That's the version that is safer for a Tim Pool or whoever. That's the version that the system is maybe comfortable with. That's what they might be willing to accept. And
I don't think it's any more safe when your end statement is the same thing, that we need to ditch and discard the Israel first mentality, no aid toward Israel, no AIPAC in Congress influencing our legislators. That's the same from both Nick and Dave's perspective. And look, this identitarian way of looking at the world is kind of indistinguishable from the woke liberal establishment, when you had people saying, well, the issue is far deeper than the rich tech oligarchs influencing our government, persuading the tech giants to censor users, etc. No, it goes far deeper than those rich oligarchs. It's about rich people. And that I see as a parallel to Nick's argument that this goes deeper than the neocons, this goes deeper than Israel. It's attached to Judaism in general. I think that's wrong. I think that's a generality that doesn't bear out. And I think it's indistinguishable from that leftist argument. And I'm not saying that's all leftists. There's plenty of great dissident leftists, especially on the Israel issue. I love them. They watch this show. But this is all to say that it's not putting culpability on the right parties. This is a collectivist mindset, I think, that needs to be rejected. And one of the points I always make on this program is some of the best Israel critics do happen to be Jewish, like Dave Smith and Jeffrey Sachs and Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal and Katie Halper and Noam Chomsky. I know he went off the deep end on the COVID regime, but he was a great critic of Israel. And the list goes on and on. It's even the atheist Jews like Christopher Hitchens that was a great critic of Israel. So I don't think that that's innately, a form of international Jewry that is responsible for all these atrocities, when I just listed you some of the best critics of Israel.
I don't want to take it to the place of the Jews for the reason, maybe for the good reason you described. And by the way, I'll give you another concession because I want to be objective. There are people that are legitimately hating Jews right now.
There are.
I saw in Florida, they're pulling up on Jews with water pistols and spraying them with water. And I got on my show and I said, fuck that.
Yeah,
I said,
and I appreciate that.
Yeah, because I don't believe in that. I'm not a piece of shit. If I saw Ben Shapiro on the street, I saw him on the street and I said, hey man, why did you do a speech? You didn't say my name. I didn't run up and try and fight him.
Yeah.
And I don't believe in attacking.
They made it out like you did.
Yeah, right. Like I attacked his kids or something. Yeah. Human shields, right? But he picked up his kid when he walked across the street. It's like, okay, bro. But
oh man, the human shield reference. Can't get enough of those when that's Israel's perennial excuse to bomb the hell out of civilians in Gaza. I'm glad these two can agree to, the absurdity that is that argument, finding humor in a very dark topic. But, the right way to handle these disagreements between dissidents is not to scream, anti-Semitism, I can't believe you platformed him. People don't realize that that is what has led to Nick Fuentes' ascension. So if you don't want Nick Fuentes to be popular, don't start screaming that he's an anti-Semite, because we know regimes speak by now, and that means that, hey, what they're having to say might be worth listening to if the regime has them in their crosshairs to the extent that they just want to ruin their reputation. That I will say about Nick.
But, you know, like, I don't believe in picking on random people. I'm not a cruel or hateful guy. And you do see that. And that video bothered me in particular because if people start to think it's okay to do that, you know, the ADL isn't necessarily wrong about the idea that it is slippery slope. You know, you pull up on somebody with a water pistol. Okay, what if it's a paintball gun next time? Is that really okay? That people are going to be harassed and like shot at with a airsoft gun or a paintball gun? No, that's bullshit. And that's denying basic dignity, basic rights. That's not Christian. That's not American. And there is an excess of that. And I agree that it should be sort of contained. But I think there's a fine line between that and saying that it is a bigger issue than the neocons, because you know, when it comes to these influential Jews, like Larry Ellison, let's say, he's not religious, but he's tight with Netanyahu. Jeffrey Epstein was tight with the left in Israel. And to the extent that you're right, Jews were the biggest critics of the Iraq war, in many cases, yeah, there's liberal Jews, but they're liberal because that's a strategy for Jews to succeed. They have these debates. What is best for the Jews? And like Bret Stephens at the New York Times, he mentored Bari Weiss. He says, Trump,
oh, God, I hate him so much.
And he sucks, you know. He's a neocon, case in point.
Yeah, I got in a big fight with him on Gutfeld's show years ago. He was such a smarmy prick. Anyway, whatever. But yeah,
douche.
Oh, God, it's the worst, the worst.
Yeah, but he says in 16 or 17, he goes, Trump is bad for the Jews because he is opposing the liberal values that have been so good to us as Jews. And it's like that sort of encapsulates when, like the ADL, for example, gets criticized. They say, well, the ADL's making Jews look bad. Or they're going after people like Shapiro and protecting people like Ilhan Omar. In other words, they're attacking Jewish Zionists, but they're not hard enough on the progressive left.
All right, this argument, I don't agree with him on this argument, because someone from an opposite perspective of him could say, hey, you know, a lot of what you talk about seems to be rooted into white identitarianism and saying stuff like, hey, the open borders immigration schemes that we're seeing, and I don't even agree it's totally open borders. There's a immigration police state known as ICE, but just saying what the perspective of someone would be, that is something that you oppose partially because of your whiteness. That Nick Fuentes, you're arguing that it's bad for white people to accept this level of immigration and everything that follows from that, welfare queens, etc., whatever he would argue. And I'm not even making that argument. I'm saying some of the things I've heard Nick Fuentes say is that, hey, white people need to band together and oppose this. How is that any different from Jews getting together and deciding what they thought, holding debates on what they thought would be more beneficial to Jews? I see this argument reflected in some of the identitarian perspectives that Nick exudes. And I'm not saying that's, you know, my position either way on immigration, but I'm saying that people could have that same perspective about some of the things that he endorses based on, you know, a different form of identity that he's kind of saying is, you know, seems to be alluding to the fact is specific to Judaism.
And what I see there is still a distilled Jewish self-interest, which is okay because we're all people and we're all advocating for the most for ourselves. But in America, we just need to do a better job of managing that. And I think that the Jewish community's out of control. Yeah. Is basically it.
Well, I would say, so in kind of like in a similar sense to because me and you both, we've both been accused of getting the call over the last few weeks, which turns out was just us calling each other and being like, I don't.
Join the club, by the way. If you're a dissident in the dissident world, you're going to be told you're controlled opposition, you got the call. If your independent mindset differs from dissident XYZ, that will happen, even if it's like a half of a percentage shade different. That's just a way of, escaping argumentation. That's the dissonant way of saying, I don't have an argument for you generally, by the way. I'm not saying that means that there's no controlled opposition. There obviously is. There obviously are feds. But that's a convenient excuse, if you ask me.
I don't think there's any evidence that Israel did it. But so when you come out on your show and you go, look, guys, I'm not seeing any evidence that Israel was behind the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And then people go, oh, it looks like Nick got the call. You're like, okay, but like the much easier answer is that he just doesn't see any evidence that Israel, right? And like people, it's like you're jumping to a conclusion. And I will say, I think you might be guilty of doing a little bit of that too. When you go like, well, look, they want the conversation controlled. It's like, or an easier answer might just be that like they've seen your hits. And they go, yeah, well, I don't want to bring a guy who's saying Hitler has aura on the show. Like, I'm open to, I do think what's horrible, what's happening to the Palestinians, but like, no, I don't think we need to go like that. So I think there's like probably, look, dude, you make your bed. You were, nobody I don't think that I know is denying that you were like horrendously mistreated when you were very young. But also since then, like there's an energy that you harness when you do that shit, and you know what you're doing with it, and that's not to say you're being disingenuous. I don't mean that at all. I just mean like you understand kind of like harnessing this radical energy of like, nah, dude, I'm staking out this position all the way over here. But it's a double-edged sword, and that also sometimes can turn a lot of people off. Although, look, you're moving the needle in a clear way, and so that is becoming more and more acceptable. I guess my point is that I don't know actually that it's possible to do that without having the excesses of the water gun thing, or perhaps much worse. I mean, look, as we've both figured out, man, I hate saying this out loud because it's against our interest, but a lot of people are kind of dumb, man, and a lot of people like can't really follow the nuance of all of that stuff.
Yeah, I agree with this, and at some points I've heard Nick Fuentes refer to people like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and, the Dave Smiths of the world of carving out a moderate position. He said that in this debate. I've also heard him say that, this is a limited hangout, right? You're not getting to the root of the problem. You might be deliberately obfuscating that or omitting that from the conversation, but in a way, I think Nick's position is actually more of a limited hangout when you don't apply the same culpability for these evils and injustices and robbing Americans of their sovereignty to other parties other than Jews that support that, including dispensationalist Zionist Christians, which I abhor that mentality. I think that's a toxic element of some forms of evangelical Christianity. It's one I don't embrace, and I consider myself an evangelical, by the way. It doesn't extend to, atheist supporters of the Israeli regime that don't happen to be Jewish. There's plenty of people culpable for this, and many of the neocons, it's probably not a majority of them, at least in their original conception, were Christians. I mean, it was the Bushes and Cheneys and Rumsfelds and Lindsey Graham. We saw it with John McCain and others that had the same foreign policy views that weren't Jewish. And yeah, you can say that's this international Judaistic conspiracy that inspired them, but they're still culpable. If they're Christians or atheists or whatever, if you supported evil, that's on you. That's not on an abstract, idea, not on a religious identity, not on an ethnicity. We wouldn't make that argument if we were trying to capture and, charge someone that had killed someone. It wasn't the gun's fault, even though a gun happened to be related. Most conservatives can understand that argument. So that's what I would say.
But to the broader like kind of Jewish conversation, I mean, look, I'm not saying it's like strictly the neocons, or I wouldn't even say that like obviously the neocons, the majority of whom were Jewish. It's not just like, I'm not claiming like, oh, they just happen to be Jewish. Like their Jewish identity obviously plays a central role in why, they feel the way they do. And there's no question that Jews, I think, and this is something I've, spent a lot of time speaking out against, because I just think it's really, there's a sickness in Jewish culture that I think is unhealthy. I think it's part of it is fundamentally built into the religion that like it's about past suffering, is like a big part of it. But the Holocaust looms so large in particularly like my parents' generation and up. I think not as much with the younger generation, but it looms so large, and there is this kind of like feeling of like, look, the Holocaust happened, and then we created our own state so that it never happens again. And anything short of that means another Holocaust happening, and
Yeah, that is so true. And you can see that come out in political debates even today. Zionists everywhere say that, we're just steps away from a new Holocaust unless we support Israel to the brim, give them, $32 billion in 2 years, help them bomb all their neighbors, look the other way while they enact genocide themselves in Gaza. The ultimate irony in this, it actually is built on a victimhood mentality and a victimhood identity. And I think that is so toxic. There's no doubt about that. And I wouldn't say that anyone should build their identity on that, even if it were true. And I do, I'm not denying the Holocaust. I think the Holocaust happened too, obviously. But at the same time, if you make that the focal point of your identity, how is that, again, different than like the liberal woke mentality where you're victimized by rich people? It's a proletariat versus bourgeois dynamic in everything. The rich people are always at fault. The workers need to revolt against them, when there are many rich people that do amazing things that make life immeasurably better for all of us, but they do it through free exchange and voluntarism rather than getting in bed with government to screw us all by getting monopoly privileges, subsidies, etc. There's a difference there, and I see this as a major problem.
And it's not right. Like it just doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to think. And I've been saying this for years. That I'm like, look, I'm a Jewish American. I've never had one obstacle put in my way because of my Jewishness. Like never once. I've had people say literally. Your fan saying shit on Twitter is the greatest struggle of my life for being Jew. I've had greater struggles, but not because I was Jewish. And I think what's appropriate when even if the story is like, oh my God, your grandparents were so horribly mistreated in Europe, and then you came to America, and now Jews are 2% of the population. They're overwhelmingly successful. I think the attitude should be like, well, we're really grateful to America, and we really love this country, and we should have nothing but loyalty to it. So like.
Yeah, not unlimited loyalty to Israel no matter what. Jews are being screwed. There's a Holocaust going to happen in a week. I totally agree with Dave on this completely. I'm not Jewish. And by the way, I know a lot of Jewish people that aren't like that. They don't take that mindset innately that, hey, they're part of this victimhood mentality. Even though Jews in the United States outperform, basically every ethnic category, at least Ashkenazi Jews do, in terms of financial metrics, wealth metrics, success metrics, education metrics, etc. You can't just say that Jews are, individually and specifically persecuted in the United States. It's just not true, despite all the propaganda.
I'm against the fact there is something like that in Jewish culture. But then again, I think it's only reinforced by people, like when they see people who they perceive as being like neo-Nazis, to be like, see, that's proof. That's proof that, in fact, there is this huge threat. And I think in some way, it seems to me like it's almost, in some ways, you and the Zionists have accepted a fundamental framework that I think a lot of the rest of us are trying to like push back on, which is that like to oppose Israel isn't to oppose Jewish people, and that's kind of stupid. This is an actual government. Now, also, I should add, like, all these things are complicated and intertwined. There is no question that part of the reason why Israel has become so dominant, like say the Mossad has become so dominant, is because there was a diaspora. It was an advantage that almost no other intelligence agency had, that you had pockets of people who you could reach out and touch, who could at least somewhat reliably, if they were called to do something for Israel, would take that as like, okay, I'm, in some way preventing another Holocaust. Like that was a huge advantage for them. And so like, again, I'm not saying like there's more complex and interesting questions. I guess, again, I'm not trying to like Big Brother you or anything on this.
Yeah.
I guess it's just like even that message that you were just sending of like, hey, we're not trying to target, people. I think like if you are to win the day on this, and we want to avoid something really bad happening that, I think none of us want to see, I think stressing that is probably important.
Yeah, I got to agree with Dave on that, and here's what I'll say. That toxic mindset that Nick and others observed, I think rightly so, after the murder of Charlie Kirk, where, you had, some leftists on Twitter, with statements about how they were glad this happened to Charlie Kirk, how he deserved for this to happen, how violence is necessary against him as an initiation of force of his ideas, which they despised. That mentality that Nick rightly ransacked, drug across the coals, and said was unacceptable. That seems to be the same mindset that, people at some points like Nick are arguing when it comes to Judaism, that it's, sometimes justified to go deeper to this problem and blame it on the left as a whole. But in this case, it's on Judaism as a whole. It's something that just doesn't make sense. It doesn't, reflect the accuracy of the situation, at who's at fault for pushing these wars, pushing AIPAC's influence in the United States, pushing the censorship campaign that Netanyahu's trying to unfurl right now, celebrating about the acquisition of TikTok for Larry Ellison, and saying we need to talk to Elon Musk, and CBS being bought out by neocons and elevating Barry Weiss, and this new campaign that's $4 million to inundate Christians with pro-Zionist ads in major metropolises. All this stuff, it is the fault of the people that are involved in it, not in one ethnicity, religion, or creed at all. And it includes people that are Christians, I hate to say. It includes people that are atheists, I hate to say. It probably includes Buddhists and Hindus in much smaller percentages in the United States. So I'm saying this. I'm saying that collective justice is always wrong, and this form of collectivism is never beneficial. And I'm with Dave on this one, in this disagreement, where it's not even accurate to say that it's Judaism. That, to me, is the limited hangout. That's the ironic part of this, is that it doesn't put responsibility on some of the parties that deserve it. And I'm not saying Nick always does that. Nick does blame the neocons. He does talk about how vile and reprehensible some of them are. But when you focus on this at its root, that this is a problem with Judaism in general, you take away blame that should be hoisted, and you blame others that should not be blamed. And I think that's where I disagree with Nick on this. Obviously, I'm glad he has the same viewpoints generally in terms of Israel that I do. The fact that they have way too much influence, the U.S. shouldn't support this. And by the way, it's cowardly to say I don't care. That's something that these two agreed with in another part of this program. So that's where I'm at. I say side with Dave on this one, but let me know if you think I'm wrong. Let me know if you think I'm controlled opposition down below. I'm the limited hangout. You're the only one that isn't controlled opposition. If you think that, let me know down in the comments. Either way, I think this was a productive conversation, and it wasn't right for many people to say, stop platforming Nick. You can't have a discussion with Nick. That is the way that Nick has been elevated in stature, by the way. We're not living in the same media world anymore. You can't just pull wool over Americans' eyes with the rise of that. And if you don't want Nick to succeed, you should probably stop acting like deranged wokesters. That is what you should do if you don't want him to succeed. But, I'm going to call your bluff. I think you're going to act like wokesters even after this interview. But let me know down below what you think. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Dave Smith. Awesome interview. I'm glad this happened. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support my channel. And in return, I will give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public. It would mean the world to me if you do that, by the way. And I thank all of my existing members. You guys are awesome, and I really appreciate it. Until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.